So ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I am back once more, answering many of your various questions in the fighting game community. We have two questions that are kind of similar, or at least they deal with the same topic this time around. And so forgive me if there's some overlap between some answers that might apply to both. But our first question of the day is, when growing a community, what's the greatest hurdle? And so this is a very broad question. So in the interest of time, I'm going to try to keep it to a lens that's focused around fighting games. Otherwise, I think you could probably have infinitely many answers to a question like this, depending on what you're actually dealing with. And so the greatest hurdle is going to kind of be different depending on the person that's looking to build, or the people that are looking to build the community. So for example, if you're someone that's not very outgoing, and you're not used to being comfortable enough to cold reach out to people and try to get people on board with your cause, that can be difficult, right? A lot of people have social anxiety in that way, where they want to have a group of like-minded people, but for one reason or another, they kind of have trouble bridging that gap and really connecting with people. And a lot of the time it does take stepping out of your comfort zone and being willing to go above and beyond. And so one of the things that has come up in conversation quite a lot in the past has been, fighting game players love to talk about what's in a live game and what's a dead game, right? These terms love to work their way into conversations over and over and over again. And people ask me all the time, what makes a dead game, right? And in my opinion, what makes a dead game is when nobody plays it. It's very simple. When no one plays it, then you can call it dead. Very easy to avoid your game being dead though, right? Because even if you have a very small group of people that are willing to play the game with each other, then the game's not dead, in my opinion. The problem is that when you're dealing with smaller communities, right? Communities that don't form themselves, for example, the big fighting games out right now, if you're a Street Fighter player, you're a Tekken player or whatever, right? You don't have to do anything to have a community in those games. They're already there because they're the new games, they're the bigger games, they're the popular, everyone's heard of them, this and that, right? They make themselves. They get new players naturally whenever DLC cycles are a thing, this and that. There's esports, there's event structure, there's circuits, there's all that stuff. You don't have to do any work to have communities in those games, right? It's just there. And I would even go even further to say that the sub-communities build themselves as well. So communities based on where you're at in the world, right? Your city's local community, stuff like that, regional, all that stuff. Character discords, right? That's another community. These things make themselves whenever the game is big. When we're talking about smaller games though, maybe games that are either older installments of series, or maybe games that were just always niche and never really had that big of appeal, or maybe just never had that many people playing them. You have to be willing to put in the work if you're looking to build a community. And the problem is, an overwhelming majority of people are not willing to do so, right? So in my opinion, right, if you want something that badly, if you want to have a community based on anything, but especially if we're talking about fighting games, and you take a look around and you're like, I can't find anything near me. No one seems to be talking about this game on social media. No one seems to be playing it for this or that reason, right? You have to first take a look at what's the problem, right? What's the problem? What's the reason that people are not playing? And there could be infinite amount of reasons for that, right? It could be because people just jump to the new game. It could be because maybe the game's net play is dog shit, this or that. There's so many different things, right? But really the overarching answer to most questions is going to be, they just never had someone willing to put the work in for them, right? And the reason that I say that is because even very, very old games, even games that for all intents and purposes, shouldn't, quote unquote, shouldn't be played in 2024. If you look at the trend of fighting games, right? And you look at certain game lineups, you'd be like, wow, I can't even believe people are still playing that game, right? But they are, because there are people, or in some cases it only takes one person, right, to just put in the work and really push for it and do what needs to be done. You need to take that responsibility upon yourself, right? If you really want it that bad, you need to create the community yourself. If you don't have one, make it yourself, right? And that goes for whether we're talking about, you know, maybe you don't have a local near you, make one, right? Now that's easier said than done. I'm not gonna go out here and say that everyone can just do it immediately and it'll be, right? But it's gonna take work, right? You need to talk to venues around you, see if they'll allow you to have space. Like, you'd be surprised how many like card shops and places like that will actually just have space that will let you guys bring setups and play at a local if you ask them, right? You can't know until you ask though. You have to do that type of work. Like, you have to be willing. Most people, overwhelming majority of people, are not willing to do that. So that's a big hurdle, right? A big hurdle is everyone thinking, oh, someone else will do it, right? I don't need to do it because someone else will, right? That's a big hurdle. That's a big hurdle. Most people are not used to having to take that responsibility upon themselves. And so if everyone thinks that way, oh, someone else will do it, I don't need to, then it never gets done, right? And then you just can't build a community because no one ever took that leap. Sometimes all it takes is one person to show that they're making the effort. And then other people will be like, yo, that guy's really trying really hard. And I also like the thing that he's pushing for. I'm going to help in any way I can, right? It's absolutely staggering how much taking that first step, that first leap, it can change everything, right? So I think that's probably the biggest one. That's probably the biggest hurdle when we're talking about, you know, building and growing a community. There's so many hurdles, but I think that's the main one. Just having that one person that's like, fuck it, I'll do it, right? Yeah, I'd be like Thanos. Fuck it, I'll do it myself, right? That's what I did. I did that. You can too. Simple as that. So the second question that, like I said, kind of goes hand in hand with this is, when building a community, what are some of the most important principles to adhere to? Now, this is very, very, like, this is even more varied than the last question, because this is going to change pretty drastically depending on a few different things. One, the common interest that you're building your community around is a big one. But also, like, what is the nature and kind of the tone of the community that you're in when you're building it early. I think like the early stages really like set the tone, and you can like kind of build on that as time goes on, as you get more and more people and, like, you know, stuff like that. But that first, that early on, like when you just have a few people and you're not like really big, the way that the people in that community interact with each other, the way they treat each other, how involved they are with each other, right? Those things matter a lot. And so I'm not going to pretend to be like some all-knowing, oh my God, I have all the answers, everyone should just do exactly what I do. But when I'm giving advice on something like this, I'm going to try to give it from a point of familiarity, right? Things that were familiar to me. When I was building my community, one of the most important things was establishing that, because, you know, I'm a Twitch streamer, and so my most of my community exists in Twitch chat, right? We have a Discord and stuff like that too, but most of your interactions with me and each other come from Twitch chat. What does that mean? Well, things like moderation, things like being communicative with each other is like really, really important, right? And so like when someone new comes into they come into the stream and they come into the chat, because they're used to me actively engaging with them, and if something that they say doesn't sit right, or I feel like it's something that they should not be talking about, or maybe they're approaching it in an ignorant way or this or that, right? I always check it immediately, right? I don't let it fester. And I talked about this in my last episode as well, right? If something is problematic, right, you need to address it immediately. And what that does is it doesn't only like attack the problem head on, but it also tells everyone else in your community that this is not something that we really want around, right? And they will stand up for it as well, right? Those are the kind of the things you want to instill. Because at the end of the day, the goal is to create a safe and welcoming environment for people that share an interest, whatever that interest may be. And anything that could take away from that, you need to make sure you take the proper steps to reduce that as much as possible. Now, there will always be shitheads in communities. That's just how it goes, right? There'll always be people that kind of but you can reduce a lot of that, right? Like, you can reduce a lot of that. It takes 2 clicks to ban someone. It's not hard, right? Conversely, it's also really easy to talk to people and say, hey, I'm not cool with you talking like that, right? I've had multiple instances like that. Someone says something in chat, I'm like, hey, that's not what we're about here. We're not going to do that, right? And they were like, oh, you know what? You're right. And they changed it, and it was never a problem again. So like a lot of the time, you don't even have to get to that point. But you should, not only as a leader, but as a community member, if it's a community you care about, right? If you actually care about the community that you're in, you should be taking those steps as well. And if you feel like it's not your place to speak up and do this or that, right? Speak to the person that's in charge, right? If you're a part of someone else's community, right? If you're part of someone else's community and you have leaders or moderators or this or that, right? Talk to them. Tell them, hey, this didn't really sit right. And they'll probably be able to explain to you like, hey, this is why this maybe isn't as big of a deal as you think it is. Or they'll say, you know what, actually, that's not right. I'm going to do what I can to take care of that, right? But yeah, the last part of it is like, you got to realize that a community is just that. Like, if you're going to build a community, the community should come first, right? Sometimes opportunities present themselves for this or that, and I've seen it before. People sacrifice their communities for like their own personal gain, right? They, maybe steer things in a certain way or do certain things. They make huge changes because they feel like it'll benefit themselves. But are you really thinking about the rest of the people, right? If you're gonna go and take the time to build a community, you should probably make sure you're taking the steps that benefit them the most. That's the point. Otherwise, then like, why did you even do it, right? Like, what's really the point? It doesn't really make a whole lot of sense unless you're like privy to that at all times. So like, yeah, though I think those are like really probably the things that I would say are probably most important. Probably the last thing I would say is like, just because you built a community on X thing doesn't mean it has to be only X thing. I think this is probably pretty important, especially when we're talking about fighting games. Fighting games are pretty niche. And so like the moment you see someone that's interested in the same fighting game or this or that with you, you're like, oh shit, like this is sick. We're all here talking about fighting games. I never had this before. You might be elated, right? But just because we were brought together for fighting games it does not mean that we can't enjoy other things together as well, right? We have watch parties in my Discord. We watch anime together. This community wasn't built on anime watching, but we do it because we're a community. We just enjoy being around each other and enjoy each other's company, right? We talk about shit that's completely unrelated to fighting games. The fighting game stuff is always going to be there. It's not going anywhere. But like, it doesn't have to be the only thing that you guys talk about, right? Humans are multifaceted. You might have other shared interests with those people as well. Or for all you know, you might get someone into something else because they never knew that you were also into that. Or you might take interest in something that they're doing. I've never heard of that before. I didn't know until relatively recently that so many of people in my community were into tabletop, right? It feels like I have 80 million tabletop players in my community now. I never knew that. I never knew people were so into tabletop. But whenever I figured it out, I was like, okay, now we got to chat for tabletop and this and that, right? And I think that's like important because like, yeah, that one thing that you built on might be cool, but like, there's probably other things that are cool too. So that's what I got for you. If you're out there and you've ever been interested in building a community and you've run into issues, feel free, leave a comment, hit me up in Twitch chat and Discord, whatever. Tell me what has been a preventative factor for you, and I'll help in any way I can because it can be rough sometimes. But if you don't do it, who will?